Our third and fourth reasons kind of go together. The third one is that God is dealing with a theocracy. He's dealing with a specific nation. And if God is dealing with Israel, a nation that has borders and an army, you expect him to deal with the nation in the way that, nations are dealt with. That includes waging wars, approving acts of trade and diplomacy, electing rulers, or if not electing, then placing rulers, kings and judges and such in place. So he's going to deal with this Middle Eastern nation as a Middle Eastern nation, which means some of his behavior is going to look a lot different than we see in the New Testament, where he's no longer dealing with a nation, but with a church that is spread out amongst many nations. More importantly, he's dealing with an ancient Near Eastern culture. Remember, that's somewhere roughly in the Middle East and ancient, long ago. He's dealing with an ancient Near Eastern culture, or various ancient Near Eastern cultures, that tied their national identity to their religion and tied military and economic success to the blessings of the gods. Basically, if you were an ancient Near Eastern person, a typical ancient Near Eastern person, during the period of the conquest, the period described in Joshua, this is kind of what your life would have looked like religiously. You would have had a choice to worship a large plethora of gods. And the way that you would have chosen your gods is who your people worshipped, who the people in the region around you worshipped, or simply who the most powerful god worshipped in the area was. And so you kind of weigh those against each other. Because there was a concept, there was a belief that nearly every god worshipped by humankind was indeed real. But they had different spheres of influence. One example of this is a god, a minor mountain god called the Baal of Peor. So he was worshipped around Mount Peor. So if you lived at Mount Peor, he might be a good choice because his kingdom, as it were, was around that mountain. But if you moved 3,000 miles away from the Baal of Peor, from Mount Peor, that god was not powerful enough, did not have a big enough reach to help you out very much. So you might stop worshiping him and start worshiping someone else. On the other side of things, there were very powerful gods that were worshipped over large regions. One example of this is the goddess Asherah, who was worshipped at various periods pretty much throughout the entirety of the Middle East. Normally, she was a consort or a queen or a wife to whoever the most prominent male deity was in any given area. But at other times, she was worshipped almost by herself, or even seen as a chief deity herself. So she was extremely powerful, so she was worshipped over a bigger area. Now, here's why this matters. Say that we have a culture that is worshiping the Baal of Peor, and someone else is worshiping Asherah, and these two nations or these two cities start to fight. The belief was that whoever had the more powerful god in that region would win the battle. So, if Asherah lost, if their nation, the nation worshiping Asherah, attacked the nation worshiping the Baal of Peor, then they would, if they were to lose, the people that worship the Baal of Peor would say, well, around Mount Peor, Baal is more powerful than Asherah, so it's a good thing to continue worshiping him. And the people who worshipped Asherah would conclude one of two things, depending on how the war went. Either Asherah is not powerful enough to conquer the Baal of Peor, but she's powerful everywhere else, or they would conclude that Asherah isn't worth worshiping, and they'd give up and start worshiping the Baal of Peor instead. Worship of a deity was integrally connected to success in diplomacy and in war and in economics, but especially in war. If you battled another nation, it wasn't just you fighting that nation. Really, your gods were testing their strength against one another, and the winner was more powerful and more deserving of worship. Israel, however, believed something kind of unique. They believed that there was only one God, and that his kingdom was not just a mountain or a region, but his kingdom was the entirety of the earth. So Israel walks into the Middle East. They travel up into the Middle East, this ragtag group of former slaves. And when they arrive, there's all these different groups asserting their gods are the most powerful. The way that they would prove in that culture that their God was more powerful than all the gods and goddesses being worshipped in the region is through battle. If Israel wins wars, it means their God is more powerful than the Baal of Peor, more powerful than Molech, more powerful than Asherah, and therefore he is deserving to be worshipped. And we understand that the Bible understands that people think this way because of the words of people like Rahab in Joshua 2, 8 through 11. Rahab says, I know the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in the country are melting in fear because of you. She's speaking this to Israelites, to worshipers of Yahweh. And she says, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, and how you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. We have heard of it, and our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. And then she goes on to ask them if they would spare her family, and they actually tell her, yes, we will spare you and your family, and gives her some instructions to make sure that her family isn't killed in the fighting, and then says, do this and we'll spare you, and then we'll invite you into our people. And she actually ends up being one of the ancestors of King David, who we read about in Samuel and his descendants in Kings. So the people of the ancient Near East understood that when two nations fought, the more powerful God would succeed. That means that when Israel wins wars, that the people on the other side would have to admit that Yahweh was more powerful than their own gods, and potentially would even convert and worship Yahweh instead of their traditional gods. All of this is important to understand, especially that bit about worshiping gods and worshiping the gods usually that win wars. Because, as we said earlier, in the Christian ethic, and really in the Jewish ethic as well, the primary goal, the primary purpose, the highest good attainable by a human being is worshiping the one true God and doing his will. So the goal in the conquest narratives is not to put people in their place, and it's certainly not genocide. It's actually to encourage worship of Yahweh. But that raises a small problem for us. Because when we read verses like Exodus 23:23, we say, all right, well, that's all good and well with all this context. Maybe Yahweh was saying, hey, we want these people to convert. But how do you convert if you're dead? Exodus 23:23 says, I'm going to completely destroy them. Other verses say things like, leave no one alive that is breathing. How if you've been killed in battle? And the answer is, you don't. But most of the people in Canaan wouldn't have been killed in battle. The point of the conquest was not total war or genocide. It was justice, dispossessing the Canaanites, pushing them out of their land, and proving that Yahweh should be worshipped. We kind of covered the last one, so let's talk about the first two. First of all, justice. As we said earlier, God has the right, and as we said in the sermon last week, God has the right to visit justice on people, to punish the wicked and to reward the righteous. And it wouldn't be good to live in a world where the wicked and the people who do wrong and do evil aren't punished. We wouldn't want to live in a world like that. Genesis 15:16 tells us that part of the purpose of pushing the Canaanites out, or of waging war against the Canaanites, is to visit justice on them for their evil. God is speaking to Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, and he says this. He says, in 4 generations, your descendants will come back here, for the sin or the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. That people group mentioned, the Amorites, is one of the Canaanite groups. So the idea is that there are these people in Canaan who are sinning horrifically, but they haven't sinned enough yet to deserve the type of punishment that is coming their way. So we're going to wait. We're going to wait. And actually, if you read other narratives like the story of Jonah, sometimes peoples like this are sinning horribly, and God says, hey, by the way, I'm going to destroy you. And then they repent, and then God's like, I won't destroy you because you figured out that you were doing the wrong thing, and you said sorry, and you're doing better now, so I'm going to leave you alone. That's pretty much what happens in the story of Jonah. So here, God is saying, hey, eventually I'm going to send my people back to Canaan, and if the Amorites haven't shaped up, they're going to be punished for what they did. Like we said earlier, this is child sacrifice, ritual prostitution, idolatry, other horrific practices in war that are much closer to our definition of genocide than anything the Israelites ever practiced. Beyond all of this, the Canaanites just should have known better. They're violating universal laws, so we just expect anyone with a conscience to know that they're doing wrong. But beyond that, the Canaanites were actually distant relatives of the Jewish people. If you read the first 10, 15 chapters of Genesis, you'll actually understand that these peoples that God is discussing, like the Amorites and the Hittites and the Jebusites, are actually relatives of the Jews. They should have known. Ancestrally, they would have been taught about Yahweh, but at some point they chose to reject him. Later on, much later on, there's a prophet named Amos who writes about the descendants of these people who survived the conquests, and, well, the things that they do are pretty horrific. And that's in the first couple chapters of Amos. So how does God punish the Canaanites? Primarily, it's not by killing them. And when we read Exodus 23:23 in simple explanations of this passage, just say, they did wrong, so God killed all of them. And that kind of raises the question, how can we say that God is merciful? I mean, he might have the right to do so, but how can we say that God is merciful, which is a core tenet of Christianity, if he's not only killing people who are actually responsible for doing wrong, but he's also like slaughtering women and children too? And the answer is, we probably would have a hard time with that. But lucky us, he's not. Here's the full context of that verse, Exodus 23:23. This is a couple verses later, Exodus 23:28 through 30. God says, I will send hornets, or I will send the hornet, which is probably a metaphor. But I will send the hornet ahead of you, and it will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Hittites from you. I will not drive them out from you in a single year, so that the land will not become desolate and the animals of the field become too numerous for you. I will drive them out little by little until you become fruitful and take possession of the land. Now notice here, in 3 verses, 28, 29, and 30, 3 separate times God says, I will drive them out. Not I will destroy them, not I will kill them, not I will slaughter them, not I will end their lives. He says, I will drive them out. That makes us go, hold up. God, you just said you were going to kill all these people. And now you're just saying you're going to push them out of the land. Which one is it? And the answer is it's the second one, because ancient Near Eastern war texts use a lot of exaggeration. When it comes to talking about conflict, this should not surprise us. The ancient Near Eastern war texts, or writings about wars from ancient Near Eastern peoples, use a lot of exaggeration. Think about it this way. I love football, and I'm a Browns fan, and this last year we won our first playoff game in, well, actually since I was born, which is cool. And I got to watch that, and they dominated the Steelers. It was a great game, and they just really, in all phases of the game, just really took it to the Steelers. If I'm talking about this with my friend Martin, who is a Steelers fan, unlucky him, I might look at him and say, man, that playoff game, the Browns really decimated the Steelers. And he would understand that what I mean is the Browns won handily. He would not take the phrase literally, because literally the word decimate means to reduce by a tenth. It's actually something we derive from an ancient Roman practice where if a legion did something considered dishonorable, usually running away during a battle, they would line them up, count them off, and every 10th soldier would be executed. It literally means to reduce by a tenth, which means if I say the Browns decimated the Steelers, literally what that phrase means is they lined up their roster and killed every 10th player, which is clearly not what happened, right? Ancient Near Eastern war texts kind of function like that. Well, they'll use this language like kill everything that is living, completely destroy, leave nothing alive. But then when we look at other records about the same conflict being discussed, we'll see that the people actually did survive, and they became a vassal nation of the nation that was speaking, or they became slaves in some cases, or in some cases, they weren't even truly defeated at all. They just lost the battle, but then they kind of got away from the war, like the war just kind of fizzled out and didn't really decisively end. And we'll still see descriptions of sieges of cities or of battles where it says that the enemy was completely destroyed. There was nothing left alive that was breathing. And the reality is, it's just an exaggeration. It's how Middle Eastern people in this period communicated about war. When God says, I will completely destroy the Canaanites, no one in Israel would have understood that to mean I'm actually going to kill everyone in this region of the world. They would have understood it to mean I am going to hand you decisive military victories and push them out of the land. And what's the point of pushing a nation out of the land? You dispossess the people in order to get them to convert. Hold that thought, because we're going to get to it in a minute. I really want to prove to you that when God says he's going to destroy the people, he doesn't actually mean that literally. Jeremiah 25:9, God says this about the people of Israel, okay? They've rebelled against him, and he says this. He says, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and I will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations, and I will completely destroy, that's the same Hebrew word, I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror and scorn, an everlasting ruin. That's chapter 25 of Jeremiah, 25:9. But then just 4 chapters later, God says this in Jeremiah 29:10. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. Ancient Hebrews were not dumb. They did not just read Jeremiah 25 and then read Jeremiah 29 and go, oh yeah, I don't think they contradict. Like they didn't just look at it and say, oh yeah, well in 25 he's saying he's going to kill all of us, and then in 29 he said that he wasn't. And the descendants of those people certainly didn't look back and read chapter 25 and think, oh yeah, God said that he was going to kill all of us and then just decided not to. That's not how they would have interpreted it. They understood that this language was intentionally hyperbolic. It was exaggerated to make a point. In fact, the religious teachers that formed while they were in exile in Babylon, a class of religious teachers called rabbis. Rabbis were famous for using exaggeration to make a point. They probably got it from God because he uses exaggeration to make a point all the time in Scripture. Jeremiah 25, God says, I'll completely destroy all of you. Jeremiah 29, he says, I'm going to bring you back from exile. This is not a contradiction. It's that Jeremiah 25 is an exaggeration. When God says completely destroy, he does not mean completely destroy. He means win a decisive victory over. It's a standard Semitism. It's an idiom used by ancient Near Eastern peoples. The Bible doesn't try to hide this either. Here's another example. Exodus 23:23, which we're familiar with, God says he will completely destroy the Canaanites. Joshua 21:44, at the end of the book of Joshua, it tells us that no one could withstand Israel, and God gave them peace on all sides. In other words, what this means is, hey, job's done. We did everything that God said that we should do. We're good. But then in Judges 1:1, which chronologically occurs right after Joshua, after Joshua died, it says, the Israelites asked the Lord, who of us will go up first to fight the Canaanites? That means if you read the entire story from Exodus all the way through Judges, the Bible tells you that God said, I'll completely destroy them, and then Joshua did everything that God told him to do, and there's still Canaanites left over afterwards. In other words, when God says completely destroy them, Joshua understood that that's not genocide that God's commanding. He's just using standard war language. God uses this same exaggeration any ancient Near Eastern people would use to communicate that they should confront the Canaanites in battle. For what it's worth, there's archaeological evidence of this as well. The traditional Western view of how the conquest went was basically that Joshua swept in and slaughtered entire cities and burned them to the ground. The archaeological evidence tells us that nothing like that happened. There was no large-scale burning to the ground, slaughtering thousands upon thousands of people that happened in that period in this area of the world. And the reason for that is we've been interpreting the passage wrong. Joshua came in and did exactly what God actually told him to do, which is to fight pitched battles, to defeat military installations in places like Jericho and Ai that had walls. Those are not what we think of as cities. They are much closer to what we would think of as a fort. And he went and he took these military locations, and when he did, he established control over the region and forced the Canaanites out, which is exactly what God told him. And why would you do this? Why would you push out a people from their land? Because the highest good that a person can do is worshiping God. And ancient Near Eastern peoples believed that if a god won in battle, is because they were more powerful and potentially more worthy of worship. The whole point of this entire strategy is to punish the Canaanites for doing wrong, to take away their land, to show them that the way that they were living was unacceptable. But even more importantly, it was an attempt at conversion. Now, this doesn't work in the modern world. It doesn't. It's not meant to. God was dealing with a specific people with specific beliefs at a specific period of time, and the only possible way to show them the error of their ways was to defeat them in battle so that they would repent and they would come and they would join the Israelites. Did this strategy work? Actually, yeah, it did. There's a few examples that are mentioned specifically, like Rahab and Joshua 2, who we've already mentioned. Her and her entire family joined the Israelites because of these military victories. Also, the Gibeonites are also recorded in Joshua. They're people who they do get reprimanded for lying, but they still survive and they become a part of the Israelites as servants in the temple. And possibly also the people of Shechem. There's a little bit of reading between the lines there, but there's a possibility the people of Shechem as well repented of their ways and became full members of the Israelite people. And beyond this, by the time that the New Testament rolls around, which is several thousand years later, the Jews have a pretty robust set of practices for taking someone who's ethnically not Jewish and allowing them to join the Jewish people. And they call those people proselytes if they go through the full process. If they go like part of the way and then they stop shy of circumcision, they're called God-fearers. And these people were more or less accepted members of the community because they understood to varying degrees at different points in their history that God actually intended these people to be permitted to worship them. There are texts that you can look at for that: Genesis 12:3, Isaiah 42:4, and Isaiah 49:6 show that Israel was always meant to share her religion and relationship with God with the entirety of the world. It's just that didn't happen on a large scale until Jesus came in the New Testament about 2,000 years ago. All right, I know that was a lot of information, so let's summarize it really quick. First of all, as we discovered last week, God has the right to rule, to judge, to demand what he desires from mankind because he gave us all that we have. Second of all, it is the highest good, the greatest duty of mankind to worship God. Third, God is not capricious. He does not order war just for the fun of it, but for specific purposes: conversion and execution of justice. And last of all, God does not order genocide. We're misunderstanding a common ancient Near Eastern idiom, a common way they would have communicated in writings about war that just means to win a decisive victory in battle, or even a not so decisive victory if you're part of a people that's more prone to exaggeration than others. So this whole description, this idea that God is some sort of moral or immoral monster, is just blatantly untrue, and it comes out of a bad reading of the text. And I understand why we read it this way, because in English it's just not that clear, but this is why it's important to seek out good biblical teachers, to do your homework, to get some commentaries, listen to some videos online. Like, it's important to put effort into your faith, because otherwise we end up carrying around these ideas about God and about the way that he behaves that just aren't true. Did God command war? Yes. Did he command genocide? Absolutely not. And beyond that, the war that God did command was for the good of the people groups involved, so that they would do what they were meant to do, so that they would worship God. It was the only functional way that that could be brought about in that period of time with those specific peoples. And do I expect God to ever behave that way again? Honestly, no, because people are so different and our cultures are so different than they were in that period of history. And the message of the gospel is now with us, which the Jews did not have the advantage of. They had a lot of advantages, but they did not have the advantage of Jesus and Jesus's teachings that modern Christians have today. So no, I don't expect that to ever happen again, but we have to understand the Old Testament in its context. And if we do, we'll see that God is not the kind of person that Richard Dawkins believes he is.